So I have met a whole lot of salespersons who understand their product very well. And in all earnestness, they go and try to conduct a need analysis of their customers. But all their efforts for need analysis falls flat on the ground because they do not understand one thing, that understanding the customer can happen only through empathy. And this is only possible when you know how to play the role of an assistant buyer. So let me quickly take you to a set of slides where we advocate that if you want to be a great salesperson, you should know how to become an assistant buyer. And what do I really mean by that? No, this is almost a utopia for someone to think that a buyer and seller can actually cooperate and co-create solutions like this. I mean, this is utopia where a buyer says, okay, Mr. Seller, please sit down. Let me explain to you my problems. Let me understand your problems. And together we will co-create a solution. This is not done. This is not practical because when the buyer encounters a seller, and I'm using the word encounters because they look upon each other as sitting on opposite sides of the table. Now, if this is the truth, then most of the time the buyer and seller are trying to show their world to the other through their own set of binoculars. So the seller is trying to force his binocular on the buyer's eyes and asking him that, sir, please look at the world through my binocular. And the buyer also puts his binocular on the seller's eyes and says, why don't you look at the world from my binocular? So do not waste your time in trying to force your binocular on the buyer's eyes. What should you do? Well, you surely have to enter the buyer's mind. So if the seller is Mr. Orange, then the Mr. Orange head has to enter the buyer, which is Mr. Blue. Unless you enter the mind of the buyer, you will not know what is going on in the mind of the buyer. Because the buyer might say something, but he might mean totally different. So you got to invade, you got to actually enter the buyer's mind. And how do you do this? The only way you can do this is by becoming an assistant buyer. So couple of things that I want to say that when you are an assistant buyer, don't try to be confrontationist, don't try to prove a point. Try to look upon yourself as someone who is going to assist the buyer in taking this buying decision. So supply the buyer with all kinds of testimonials, all kinds of proofs, all kinds of documentation, and ask the right kind of questions to the buyer exactly the way an assistant buyer would have done to the buyer. Very interesting, isn't it? And what are the questions that an assistant buyer would have asked? Well, if the buyer had an assistant buyer, which for the moment the seller is supposed to become, these are the 5 questions which the assistant buyer would have asked the buyer. He should have asked that, Mr. Buyer, what is the buyer's interest in buying? What is your risk? What is your pain? What is your challenge that you're trying to solve? If the buyer is the buyer going to make a financial gain in this deal, right? Does the buyer have any other alternative to solve his problem? What will make this seller the best option to buy from? And can you trust this seller? If no, what do you need to trust him? So see, if you are able to go to the buyer's mind like an assistant buyer and not like a seller, and seek answers to these 5 questions, come back to the selling table and answer those questions like a salesperson. So if you see on the screen, ask questions as assistant buyer, get the right answers, and give answers as seller. In the process, you would have bridged the gap between the buyer and seller. And that's what will make you an excellent seller. That's what will make you a value seller. The buyer will not look upon you as an adversary. The buyer will not look upon you as someone who is there to sell anyhow. Instead, the buyer will look upon you as an assistant buyer, as a friend, as a colleague who is actually helping him in his buying decision. So friends, if you have liked this English version of the Hindi video that I had made earlier, Please subscribe to my channel and stay connected because I, Sanjay Singh, your sales coach, is going to upload one new video on sales every day on my channel. Till now, take care. Bye bye.